This video is how to create a plaster version of a Day of the Dead skull. The supplies that I used were strips of plaster. It has dried plaster on there and it just needs to be dunked in water. I used this plastic face mold, an expo marker, and scissors. If I didn't already say bucket of water, that too. Oh, and you'll want to cover the surface you're working on because plaster doesn't like to come off very easily. First order of business is to cut your plaster strips into workable sizes. So I'm just going to cut this. It's good actually to have some that are small. Oh, this one was folded, so this one's twice as big. But I'd say that like 1/2 inch in width is actually really useful. This is probably my most useful size of a strip, is like 1/2 inch. If you want to have some that are wider, that kind of helps when you're just going over larger areas. Oh man, this one was connected too. So I'd have like a variety of some, that shape, some that one, some in between. And always like I layer this up, so I'm cutting through about 4 layers at a time or 5 layers. Really as many as you can, because it's just a time saver. If you're cutting through one sheet at a time, you're never going to get to enough strips that you would even need to use on your own skull, okay? So cut through multiple layers at a time. For my students, you are going to have to cut all these strips before we get going with the water, because you don't want to be like, using scissors and all that once you already have wet hands and wet plaster all over. Okay, the next order of business is that you're going to draw the outline of your skull and the eye openings on your skull. So I like to do everything else closed off, like the nose and mouth, and just leave the eye openings open so that it does become like a mask if you wanted to wear it that way. There's like the inside view. And so basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw the outline of my skull. It's going to come pretty close to the edge on the top, I've decided. So I'm just going to, oh sorry, I didn't realize you couldn't see. I'm just going to outline this edge all the way down to about here. The cheekbones kind of take effect like right in this zone. So I'm going to kind of chop in, drawing like a choppy cheekbone, making sure I'm trying to make it kind of symmetrical, but if it's not perfect, that's all right. And yeah, the cheekbones are kind of corner into like the edges of the mouth, kind of like that. And then I'm going to drop down from here and kind of square off my chin, okay? So that's going to be the outline of my skeleton skull, just a little bit smaller than that of a human face. If you want to like make these really rounded and smooth, that's fine. But basically the top is just outlining, and then we add a bump for a cheekbone, and then just kind of drawing a square jaw under there that doesn't go all the way down. If you want to bring the jaw out a little bit wider, just so your mask is like a little bit larger, maybe you could do that. It is pretty much up to you, but just draw the outline. Now I'm going to draw the openings in the eyes, and a lot of students have trouble making the eye openings the same size and shape. So if you're right-handed, start on your left side. If you're left-handed, start on the right. Basically, you're starting on your weak side. So if you draw your weak side first, what will happen is it will become a little bit easier to duplicate that when you draw it on your strong side. So basically, I like to draw this in. Instead of using just curves on this line, I draw it in kind of as like straight lines that kind of meet together to make somewhat of curves and things. So that's going to be my eye opening on this side. On this side, I'm going to try and duplicate that, having things at least be the same height, maybe about the same size. If it's not exactly the same shape, I don't think it'll be the end of the world. Sometimes they're a little bit more rounded up here by the eyebrow bone. All right, hopefully that's somewhat even. If not, whatever. Okay, all right. The next step that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and start covering this in plaster strips. The red are my barriers, so I'm not going to go outside of the red on the outside edge. I'm going to stay inside the red, and I'm not going to go inside the red for the eyes. I'm going to leave the eyes completely open. If you plaster over the eyes, it is impossible to cut through without destroying the whole mask. So I would definitely recommend working your way around those things. I know that in the future you guys are going to have a lot of details. Do not draw those details on here in expo marker, because all you're doing is wasting your time, okay? We are going to cover the whole thing in plaster. It's going to be totally white, and then we're going to go in and start painting details and drawing in details and that kind of stuff. So right now we are not concerned with details, just the outline and the eye openings, okay? When you guys go to get ready started with plaster, you're going to take one of your plaster strips. Let me just move this stuff out the way. Bring your buckets into play. I'm going to dip that guy in the bucket, and I'm just going to kind of squeeze off any excess on the edges. Be careful, because if your little plaster strip gets folded over, it becomes a little bit thicker and then maybe harder to work with, harder to smooth up, okay? Now, right as I lay that plaster strip down on here, what I want to happen is I want to fill in all those little holes. There is like plaster dust on these guys. And so what you're doing is you're kind of remanipulating the position of that plaster dust to be very smooth. As smooth as it looks when it's wet, that's as smooth as it will look when it's dry. So if it's not very smooth, then yeesh. Okay, see, so I'm kind of running my fingers over the strip like that to close off some dots before I even connect it to my skull here. It's good to crisscross your strips. If you're laying a bunch of strips on the forehead, laying them all the same direction isn't very strong, or at least if you're doing that, you should overlap them just a little bit. That makes for a stronger sort of structure. I don't know what I was trying to say there. All right, so see, like this one, I'm going to overlap it a little bit. I'm going to smooth those guys out as much as I possibly can right now. They do dry pretty quickly, and once they are dry, there is no further manipulating of them, okay? If you happen to get a strip that's like already kind of hard, like maybe it got wet last time, just toss those ones, because if they've already been wet and dried, they will not form the way you want them to. Sorry, I got some used strips out because I didn't want to cut a bunch of new ones, but I probably shouldn't have, because it seems like they got kind of wet last quarter. Yeah, this one doesn't seem to be like working very well either. You can kind of rotate and turn these strips to like fill in where you need them to. So even though it's obviously a straight strip, you can kind of manipulate it, fold it on top of itself to kind of morph to whatever shape you're looking for. Some people are really meticulous and they spend a lot of time like cutting the strips down to be the exact measurement. And if you are that kind of meticulous person, I guess go for it. I am not as meticulous, I would say, and less so. I do like a smooth sculpture though, because if your sculpture is not very smooth, it becomes very difficult to paint on, okay? So the smoother the better, try for that at least, okay? Sometimes if you have too much water, the strips on here will keep sliding around, so maybe too much water is not a great thing. You'll also want to make sure that everywhere on your mask gets about at least 2 coats of plaster, okay? I'm going to kind of square up this jaw down here, kind of manipulate that plaster to be the shape I want. If it's not 2 coats, you're going to find that it's like really weak, really feeble, and just like mushing up while you're trying to work on it, okay? So at least 2 coats. If some areas are obviously going to get more, like where you're overlapping by the nose and that's fine. Plaster, when it dries pretty hard. It does not come out of clothing. And the surface that you're working on, you definitely want to make sure and cover that because it is not very easy to clean up. It's kind of like acrylic paint, whereas like when it dries, it's like solid. Okay, I'm gonna run mine right through here. You can see how I'm going through and kind of smoothing out all those dots. You guys are gonna love this project. It's really fun, and I feel like sometimes people like have a problem with getting their hands wet or hands dirty even. And I feel like once you do it, it's just kind of like a stress reliever or something. I don't know. For me personally, I feel like it's like I like doing it. I like getting in there, getting my hands dirty. Sorry, too much information. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to make sure that I have a nice thick double coat around my border, and I'll turn you guys back on whenever I have that done. Hey, just a little sidebar as I'm working here. I'm finding that the bigger strips are like a little bit easier just to control and to lay flat and to make them be smooth. Not to mention, obviously, that it makes your sculpture like move a little bit quicker. Of course, now I've mutilated the skinny one. So what I've found about the skinny ones is that you probably won't need a ton of those. The best part about the skinny ones is that they're easy to manipulate as far as like turning corners goes. So if you're trying to like turn a corner and like run it around an eye socket, that's really helpful. But other than that, they're kind of like, they get out of order really easily. Like they get twisted and kind of create these like bally areas. So if you want to have a pair of scissors handy just to snip away like excess, or like if you have any little twisty areas, as you go around those edges, once you get done, if you want to kind of smooth out the plaster a little bit and then just kind of like trim up, kind of push it against your finger like that, or even around these edges, kind of mush over, get rid of some like little plaster clumpies if you have them, okay? Okay, I've got my plaster form covered in about 2 coats. I was actually just going around with my fingernail and kind of pressing in on the edges just to kind of smooth up and clean up the outline. If there's any little stringies or that later, don't worry too much about it. We can kind of snip off the thin stuff with scissors, but the thicker areas, once they dry, they're really difficult to cut through. It ends up like kind of cracking the plaster or that. My eyes are definitely not symmetrical. I feel like this one's definitely wider. This one's a little taller. But you know what? Don't lose sleep over it. Don't let it drive you too crazy. because when we go in to do the painting, you can kind of manipulate the paint to where you just don't even notice that. People will really notice the designs. I'm sure that on this guy, they aren't perfectly symmetrical, but like I said, you just won't notice those things. So anyway, we want to let this dry out for probably close to a week before we go in and start doing our primer coat and then start painting on it. We will need to do a coat of primer, which is basically just like a white acrylic paint, before we put on tempera paints. For some reason, tempera paints and plaster, they just don't mesh. You paint on the paint on the temperas, they look great, and then they peel and flake off, which is really disappointing. So yeah, I'm just gonna let this dry out and I'll get back with you for the painting video.